cause that you close down a $30 trillion economy and start it back up, you're going to have problems in the unwinding of the shutdown. So we should never, ever do it again. The other consequence we have of shutting it down is borrowing $6 trillion. The debt has to be purchased. Some of you purchased it. Thank you for buying our debt. Foreign countries purchase it. China owns $1 trillion. Japan owns $1 trillion. Countries altogether own several trillion of our 30 trillion. But the Federal Reserve owns the bulk of it. The Federal Reserve, you say, well, what's the big deal? They own our debt. Well, they didn't have any money to begin with. They just created money to purchase our debt. It's a fiction. It's the creation of new money. So for the last 3 years, the M2, which is a measure of the money supply, has been going up at 15% a year. Annualized, it was going up last January at 27%. That is inflation. Inflation is an increase in the money supply. It increases the demand generally across all products, and we're seeing the consequences. One of the unintended consequences is you have people elected to government who say, I'm going to bring you free stuff. I'm going to bring you free college, free housing, and free food, and free health care. But it's not really free, and particularly if it's borrowed, the unintended consequence is who's hurt worse by inflation? The people we ostensibly were going to help with the free stuff, but they can't afford to live in an inflationary cycle. Many of us can. We may not like it, we may gripe about it, but we can afford to live in an inflationary cycle. If you make $25,000 a year, you probably can't really afford the gasoline now, or the gas prices, or the meat. If you're a senior citizen, you're on fixed income, you can't. So inflation is a tax, but it hurts worse the people who are least able to afford it, and the same very people that somebody said they were going to give free stuff to. So there is nothing that's really free. And we do a lot of free stuff, but we've done an extraordinary amount of free stuff, $6 trillion worth. We've never, ever borrowed this much money this quickly. It pales, World War II even pales to this. So the repercussions are where we are now. I grew up in the 70s, and I remember one of government responses was price control. So I was 16 in 1978, 79, and just got my license, and I could drive the old, nasty old station wagon that my parents let me drive. You couldn't get gas. There were lines because price controls don't work. Price controls lead to shortage, so hopefully we won't try that again. Although there are people saying, those mean oil and gas countries, if we could just force them to lower their prices, it'd be all over. Well, if you set the price of gas at $2.50, it'd be great, and there'd be no gasoline. Price controls don't work. But the other thing is it's a mistake not to understand inflation. You have people saying, well, the oil and gas companies are greedy. It's like, well, did they just become greedy? I mean, they weren't greedy last year, the year before. They all got together and they went to the greed meeting and they all became greedy this year. Greed is just an accusation. It's a pejorative. It's sort of like, if it's your money, it's greed. If it's my money, it's just self-interest. You know what I mean? So it really is it's an empty accusation. It would deserve an F grade if you were in the 6th grade trying to write a paper on what causes inflation. But that's what people are saying. The only way we get through this is we're going to quit digging the hole. We've got to quit adding debt. Now, there are economists who say that in order to slow down inflation, ultimately interest rates have to rise above the inflation rate. Inflation's 9.1. Anybody eager for 10 or 11% interest rates? In 1980, they went all the way up to, I think, prime hit 21. Inflation hit 14.7% in 1980. So we still have a little ways to go. We're at 9.1, and depending on how you measure it, some people think it's a lot higher. You know, if you add in rent and fuel, which don't normally get counted, I think, in the CPI. But the Fed has begun to raise the interest rates, and some are saying, well, don't do too much, you'll kill the economy. Maybe. If you do too little and we have 15% inflation, what does that do to the economy? Or what if we become Sri Lanka? I'm hoping we don't become Sri Lanka, but Sri Lanka is, you know, talk about January 6th. They had January 6th times a million. The whole place it's in chaos. The president's flown out. The horde has overtaken the capital. But they did several things. They became subservient to climate alarmism, and they banned synthetic fertilizer. So it was a country that always had enough food. They may have been poor, but they always had enough food. Their rice is decreased by 50%, their rice production. They're now starving in Sri Lanka. They also piled on a lot of debt. They've canceled their foreign debt, and they're no longer able to make their payments. I'm not saying we're going to become Sri Lanka, but there are examples of people who get overextended. So the first thing we should do is not become so overextended. It means living within our means. As I travel around Kentucky, every time I stop at county government, I say, this is what we need. We never have one discussion. I've been here for 2 terms. I've never seen one discussion over, well, this project's a little more important than this one. That happens every day in Lexington, happens every day in Warren County. Your county judge and your magistrates get together and they vote. They have like $10 million, whatever the fee, whatever the number is. And there's a certain amount of roads and ditches, and they say which ones are the ones we're going to fix this year, and which ones we wait and discuss next year. That discussion never happens in Washington. So we recently had a vote on sending $40 billion to Ukraine. Nobody bears any penalty, so nobody cares. It's like, well, Ukraine, yeah, we sympathize. I sympathize with Ukraine. I hope they win the war. But at the same time, where's the money coming from? How much are we going to have to expend? And where is there a trade-off? So, for example, if everybody in Kentucky wants to support Ukraine, I've got a way we can do it, and we pay for it. It'd be an honest way. We do a Ukraine war tax. If each of you will put forward $500 apiece, all the taxpayers in Kentucky and the country, we could have the $40 billion. That's the first $40 billion. Come September, they've already said they need another $40 billion, and they're already talking about their economies in shambles. The country is a ruin, and I'm not saying it's not. I have sympathy for them. It's all Russia's fault. It's all Putin's fault. And yet, is it all our responsibility to rebuild the place? Now, if we're running a surplus of $1 trillion, it's like, well, maybe we could with our surplus. We run an annual deficit of $1 trillion. Before we did all the COVID lockdown and all the bailouts, we were running $1 trillion short. We've got to think about, what is fiscally right and fiscally responsible for our country. We will get through this, though, and I'll end where I began, and that is we're an amazingly resilient economy, an amazingly robust economy, and despite the bad things government does, despite the obstacles that government places in our way, our economy still continues to thrive. Even now, as I travel Kentucky, people are like, can't find enough workers. There's a whole other problem we can talk about, but it still means there is employment going on. There still seems to be somewhat of a boom phase going on. So we will get through this, and all I say is that we have to think of unintended consequences. We have to think of what we can afford to do, and the federal government should act more like your local government. Prioritize spending, say this is more important than this, and this can wait till the next year or has to wait till next year because we don't have money. It's not happening at all in Washington, and that's a debate I think we need to start. Thank you very much. That stirring bit of good news.
We have time for questions?
Yes.
Okay. Crystal ball, the upcoming election.
I thought we weren't supposed to talk about politics. I think the winds are behind Republicans now because of the economy and because of inflation. Inflation is not something that can be hidden. Everybody sees it every day. They go to the grocery store, the price at the pump, and it's hard for the people in power not to suffer politically because of that. The other thing that's going on in our country is people are moving from high tax states to low tax states. So Congress is shifting. New York loses a seat, California loses a seat, Illinois loses a seat. I can't remember who else, but those are high tax states. And where are the seats going? Texas and Florida. And with both redistricting and population shift, there's probably 5 or 10 seats that shift the other way just because of where the population is moving. And I think the Senate's still 50-50. The Senate we are pretty evenly divided as a country, and particularly in some states. Georgia's dead even, Arizona's even, Nevada's dead even, Pennsylvania's pretty close to dead even. So there's a lot of states where it'll be very, very close. Anybody else? Yes.
You discussed the impact of printing money on inflation, but what's your view on the impact of regulation on inflation? I mean, one of the reasons fuel prices have gone up is lack of refinery and things of those nature.
Yeah, regulations can add to cost and add to the inflationary pressure, so can taxes. So one of the things that's being discussed now, we thought we had sort of killed this idea, but they're talking about putting a special new tax on pass-throughs. And I was told the other day that we have 26 million businesses in our country, and 25 million of them are pass-throughs. Almost everybody is an S versus a C corporation. So I think the taxes would be a terrible idea right now to add a special new tax on the pass-throughs. but regulations are the same way. And particularly with oil and gas is worse than all the others. A component of oil and gas prices going up is generalized inflation, but some of it's additionally regulatory, some of it's additionally supply oriented in the sense that this administration has frowned upon new leases for drilling, new places for exploration. Anwar is something we've debated for 30 years around here. It's an oil-rich area of Alaska that has enough oil to replace any import needs we would probably ever need, and we voted in Congress to open it up. This administration, by executive order, stopped that. And so yeah, there are a lot of things on the supply side, regulatory side, tax side that add to it, and the war also is a component. I mean, it's people say, oh, you know, Biden says it's all about the war. He overemphasizes the war, but the war is a component of it too. But regulatory pressure is a big burden. One of the good news for business, if you're looking for good news, is a Supreme Court decision on the EPA that basically, in the past, there has always been a presumption that the regulatory agencies can do what they want unless they're explicitly told not to. Now we're changing the presumption to they can only do it if they're specifically told they can do it, which is the way really the law should be. If the law legally specifically told them they can create a regulation, they can do it. If it doesn't, it's not like tie goes to the government always. And so the ruling there will have a great deal of ramifications, and hopefully we'll see more rulings like that from the Supreme Court, which will hopefully help with some of the regulatory pressure. Yes?
How do we continue to stay competitive on the world stage when we play by a set of rules that the rest of the world doesn't have to play by?
No, it's a good question. I mean, like, you know, people say China cheats, and that's probably true. They say China steals intellectual property, probably true. I talked to somebody the other day. I was visiting a high-tech business, and I was like, oh, do you get patents?